Let me start things off by taking you back, way back, eons ago to March. On Friday, March 13th, I was invited to a meeting with a client to discuss how they were responding to the worsening pandemic. During the call, they shared their complex plan to zone their corporate headquarters so their employees could continue to work at the office safely. I hung up with a long list of to-dos for my team: posters, instructional emails, town hall scripts, podcast plans, and more, all due as soon as possible. I'm sure you can guess what happened next. By the time the town hall occurred on Monday, March 16th, those carefully detailed plans for continuing office work were scrapped by a complete office shutdown. Nearly every employee would be working from home, which meant that all of our work from that weekend was useless. But that's how it was for communicators back in March. One day, it was business as usual. The next, companies were shutting their doors, deploying entire workforces to work remotely, and swimming in the uncertainty of the future. Fast forward to present day. 8 months after that urgent call, things are not fine. For many business leaders, this has been a crash course in communicating effectively during a crisis with no end in sight. We all know how critical crisis communications are for business reputation and continuity, but we've learned that our definitions of crises were narrow and short-term. It just doesn't work for an ongoing and evolving chronic crisis. COVID-19 has forced leaders to rapidly evaluate how to sustain their business while communicating with employees who have had to adapt their own ways of working. Employees have been faced with remote working, facilitating their children's education, isolation from traditional sources of support, social distancing, financial concerns, canceled and upended plans, and grief over the way things were. And it's far from over. Employees are overwhelmed and need clear, timely information from their companies now more than ever. Today, we'll discuss why it's critical to create an internal communication strategy for a chronic crisis, as well as steps you can take to build a unique communications plan for your organization. I'll also share real-life examples of communication strategies that are helping companies and their employees survive and thrive through the unique circumstances of COVID. I'm going to assume that you agree with me that employee communications are important. Otherwise, you wouldn't be scarfing your lunch in front of a screen right now. But not all executives are getting it when it comes to the why behind a robust employee communication strategy. The IBM Institute for Business Value surveyed employees and executives from April through August of this year. Its research shows executives recognize the intense pressure of employees' circumstances, with many saying that employee well-being is one of their highest priorities. However, the research shows a huge gap between what executives think and how those employees actually feel. While 86% of employers believe their organization is providing clear guidelines and expectations for how the organization will work, only 51% of employees share that same belief. An even smaller percentage of those employees believe their organization is supporting the physical and emotional health of its workforce. And only 38% of employees believe their organization is helping staff learn the skills they need to work in a new way. To me, that looks like an opportunity for leaders who can get this right when most seem to be struggling. Let's take a look at how communications have evolved over the last 8 months. Back in March, critical communications had to enable remote work, establish new health and safety measures, explain on-site work changes, and share strategies for how to be productive and profitable under these new parameters. Companies' next phase of employee communications varied wildly based on how they were affected by the pandemic. In an article posted in June, McKinsey & Company suggested that because actual experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic have been varied, organizations should be segmented into survivors, adapters, and thrivers. Survivors are companies struggling to stay in business. Adapters have had to change their business models radically as a result of COVID. And alternatively, thrivers are well positioned because of extra demand or because they were already working remotely. For survivor companies that are struggling, they've likely had to make significant headcount reductions or reduce compensation to stay afloat. They're dealing with their employees' fear and uncertainty, along with increased workloads. For clients in this group, I recommend that they address these trials and tribulations head on. Companies cannot pretend their people are not struggling, so they need to practice empathy, be transparent about the company's business strategy and performance, and reduce uncertainty by being clear on the path forward. Critical employee communications for survivors could be regular state of the business meetings where leaders can share data about how the organization is performing and areas that need extra help. Adapter companies have likely introduced a tremendous amount of change for their teams. For these organizations, this is an opportunity to update and communicate their new vision for the future. To turn the ship, it's critical to gain buy-in from employees from the bottom up. We help companies in this segment develop and consistently communicate new processes and ways of work with a clear, strong message on how this new way forward will help the company navigate the pandemic and beyond. The third group, thrivers, have been able to ride the wave of change to be better positioned to succeed. For companies in this group, it's definitely a more comfortable place to be. When profits are up and business is booming, it's easy to ignore the challenges that are facing teams. Don't. Increased profits might mean job security for a workforce, but it doesn't always equate to employee engagement. Employees in thriving companies are still dealing with learning new ways to work and all of the other changes that come from reduced support and increased isolation. Thriving companies need to consider creating a shared purpose, engaging employees on how to solve challenges for the business ahead. A shared purpose unites. Here, I want to focus on one of our clients that is definitely a thriver. Despite the pandemic, their growth and profits are at an all-time high, but they have not rested. They have only increased communications, sharing new processes and procedures, encouraging employees to help solve challenges, providing training on remote work best practices, and sharing their expectations for their employees and the future of work. Some of the COVID-specific resources we worked with them to develop were an evolving work environment toolkit that helped leaders understand how to operate in this new environment and empowered them to support their teams in new ways. We help produce regular podcasts and webinars for team members to hear about the latest conditions and important changes. We developed ongoing pandemic survival segments for their quarterly town halls. My favorite of these were tips for hosting a virtual Kentucky Derby party, complete with fancy hat contest. For several months, we highlighted their employees' amazing work and dedication to doing good in communities across the country. Not only is it good practice to sing the praises of employees, it was particularly moving for us at Small Potatoes as we interviewed employees and wrote more than 40 stories that showcase people's generosity and the resilience of the human spirit. And this company continues to evolve their communication strategy for their employees. Through it all, their actions continue to support the inclusive culture they've worked so hard to build. I want to take a few minutes here to talk about everyone's favorite subject of recent years, thanks to my personal spiritual advisor, Brene Brown. It's vulnerability. Specifically, I want to encourage everyone, whether you are a communicator or not, to share your vulnerability at work. Sometimes the most effective internal communications are our connections with people at work. An August 7, 2020 Harvard Business Review article stated that nearly 40% of global employees surveyed by Qualtrics and SAP said that no one at their company had asked them if they were doing okay. And those respondents were 38% more likely than others to say that their mental health had declined since the outbreak. We can help each other by sharing our struggles openly. It helps others know they are not alone. We can check in on coworkers with school-age children who are studying at home. They are juggling so much. Even if there's nothing we can physically do to relieve their burden, we can show them we see them and acknowledge them. And when leaders are vulnerable, that has real impact. In fact, some of the most impactful internal communications I've seen this year showcase leadership's real emotions and struggles. After George Floyd was murdered last summer, the C-suite of one of our clients responded quickly and powerfully. The CEO and head of HR both shared their emotional commitment to action for the Black Lives Matter movement via selfie videos that were shared with their employees. We quickly created a communication strategy around their corporate-wide initiative to hold real talks with every employee in their company. These facilitated sessions brought small groups of employees together to discuss the topics most critical to them. Now, the feedback from the sessions is being used to address gaps in the company's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, among others. When it comes to employee communications, we can be strong and vulnerable. So now we're 8 months into the pandemic, and as we established previously, things are definitely not fine. So what now? The long tail of the pandemic has taken its toll on employees, whether they're now full-time remote workers or frontline team members keeping our economy going. Leaders are likely to see employees struggling with anxiety, depression, burnout, trauma, and PTSD. According to that Harvard Business Review article, experiences will vary based on an individual's race, economic opportunity, citizenship status, job type, parenting and caregiving responsibilities, and many other variables. Although we've adjusted to a new normal, none of us is sure how long this will last or what comes next. COVID-19 cases are surging across the country and abroad again, which leads me to ask, does your company have a plan in place in the event of another lockdown? If your organization is still trying to work off of a crisis communications plan developed for a short-term disaster, like a flood or a network outage, or if it has no internal communication strategy at all, I'm here to help. Spoiler alert, the key is to create your own strategy. In this next section, I'm going to share a lot of how-tos, but ultimately, try a lot of it, keep what works for your organization, and set aside the rest. Every company's approach will be uniquely its own, but these tips can serve as a starting point for building a new strategy that works for where you and your employees are right now. And these tips are not limited to COVID-specific communications. My examples will be focused on helping employees deal with the pandemic, but you can apply these points to any business objective. So let's start with the basics. Your communication strategy is high level. This is your company's solution to move from where you are now to where you want to be. Your communications plan is all the specifics of what you're going to say and how, when, and to whom you're going to say it. Put more simply, a strategy is about high-level thinking. A plan is about ground-level execution. The first order of business when developing a communication strategy, create a cross-functional team that will develop the narrative around the situation at hand and how your company is handling it. This team most likely needs to include leaders from these areas. This mix of leaders will help identify issues and how they should be addressed. Their leadership and buy-in will bring credibility to your communications, allowing you to share openly and transparently. This team should meet regularly to review ongoing developments and evaluate and update strategies and action plans. Communication needs to be an important item on the agenda at each meeting. The good news is, in many instances, most companies' existing crisis communication plans have already dictated who is part of this group. Next, you must understand your audiences. List all job titles, locations, and divisions. As you can imagine, these diverse roles will likely require different messaging. Now, it's time to identify your organization's communications resources. We frequently use channels like these. Refer back to your list of job titles, locations, and divisions. For each specific internal audience, capture each channel used to reach them. Consider how each channel is currently being used. Is there a specific cadence or timing interval for each channel? Does that cadence need to be altered to communicate important information more frequently, or are employees overwhelmed already? What are the capabilities and limitations for each channel? For example, some companies are limited by email because only a portion of their employees have company-provided email addresses. My best tip here is to make sure that the channel fits the message. For example, please do not send a text message to notify employees about a reduction in pay or furloughs. However, a text message might be the perfect channel to use when reminding employees about office protocols they need to follow when attending an on site meeting. Okay, you've put together your cross functional team. You've defined your audiences and channels. It's time to bring in your organization's current business objectives and goals to round out your communication strategy. Questions to consider. What's the story you want to tell? How do you want your employees to feel? What are the biggest impacts to the company and how will they affect your people? What information do employees need to know to understand what is expected of them? How do their actions help the company meet its business objectives? Got it? Great. You're now ready to develop your communications plan. First, map each business goal to its impacted audiences. Include communications channels and timing to ensure you have a comprehensive plan in place. Develop key messages for each communication objective to incorporate in your communications plan. Create these by audience, ensuring the tone and format are appropriate and suitable for the channel. Messages should always be clear, concise, accurate, and timely. When creating the communications themselves, the tone should be respectful, empathetic, and encouraging. Whenever possible, internal communications should seek to engage, motivate, and inspire. Reminder, being honest about your struggles as a leader opens the door for employees to feel comfortable talking with you about their own challenges. When managers describe their struggles, it makes them appear human, relatable, and brave. Research shows that authentic leadership can cultivate trust and improve employee engagement and performance. This communications plan is an opportunity to build trust with employees by providing transparency during this time of uncertainty. Transparency during COVID looks like incorporating these key topics into your communications plan and messaging. Where employees can find the latest information on company changes, everything from changes to operating hours to staffing and employment. Measures the company is taking to keep employees safe. Information on how the company is monitoring the changing situation. And how employees can ask questions. Organizations may have already addressed these topics back in the early days of the pandemic. However, they may have had to act on the fly. I recommend going back to review your company's employee communications from March and April so you can look for ways to readdress these topics more comprehensively now or in the future if needed. Measurement is an important part of your plan as well because you can use metrics to track employee engagement and then adjust your communications plan as needed. Start by establishing clear, measurable goals in your communication plan. Then, list how you will measure success for each goal. Decide how often you will check your progress and capture that too. Keeping track at regular intervals will help you determine whether your communication strategy is successfully meeting your business objectives. Over my 20-year career in employee communications, I've seen the topic of measurement evolve from how do you even measure the impact of communications without ESP to measurement is critical to understand the impact of communications and leadership expects it. As a result, now there are many different ways to measure the success of internal communications, and each has its advantages. When it comes to measurement, you want to understand the reach and impact of your communications. Reach is easier to measure if you have the right tools. Companies can determine how many employees they are reaching by looking at email read rates, page visits, video views, and document downloads. If you don't know where to find that data, work with your IT department or invest in third-party software. More to come on that later. Impact is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Communications can impact employee behaviors, employee performance and productivity, employee retention, and the holy grail of measurement, employee engagement. All important factors for your company. Measuring employee behaviors can be as simple as looking at whether employees are doing what you are asking them to do. For example, are hourly on-site employees wearing their masks correctly and consistently through their entire shifts? Employee performance and productivity is measured by tracking your company's specific performance indicators. This measurement is important for your communications because if your employees aren't meeting performance and productivity standards, that might mean you're not communicating expectations clearly. Ask, do employees have the tools they need to be successful? Are you taking into account the strains of their daily lives, families, obligations, and responsibilities? Employee retention is another relatively simple thing to measure. Are employees staying with the company? And if they're not, are you conducting exit interviews to understand why they are leaving? Feedback from exiting employees is gold. Use that feedback to further refine your employee communication strategy and plans. A couple of months ago, my daughter Alice quit her job at a major pizza chain because she didn't feel like her work meant anything. Just imagine if she shared that with her manager during an exit interview, and then her manager used that to communicate with employees about the importance of food delivery to exhausted parents during this pandemic. That could have made a world of difference for her. Now, everyone loves to talk about employee engagement, but how can you measure something that during normal times fluctuates daily and now fluctuates moment to moment depending on whether your toddler has crashed your Zoom call or your parents have been forced to quarantine because they won't stay out of the damn Walmart? Sure, you can get an idea of engagement during Q&A sessions or town halls by measuring the amount of employee participation. And most companies deploy an annual engagement survey. During this particular time, especially, I recommend that companies track employee engagement using pulse surveys. A pulse survey is a short survey that is sent to employees on a regular basis. It provides a pulse check on topics like employee satisfaction, communication, relationships, and work environment. The key for pulse surveys is that they allow companies to track the same item over time, so you can see how it changes from survey period to survey period. You may be asking, is there value in surveying employees now when things are so uncertain? The answer is, of course, yes. Besides being great sources of business intelligence, surveys let your employees know that the company is listening to them. And they can be your company's canary in a coal mine when it comes to identifying new areas of concern. Most importantly, this is your opportunity to show your employees that you want to improve, and that builds trust. A May 8th article from Great Place to Work includes these questions to help generate clear and actionable feedback. What is one way we can continue to support you? What is your biggest concern right now at home or at work? Is there anything the organization can do in light of these circumstances that would be helpful to you? What communication and updates would be valuable to you during this time? What suggestions do you have that the organization should consider to restart our business when the timing allows? The article goes on to explain that asking these types of questions is important because your employees know best, especially when it comes to what they need. Employees also have valuable ideas about how the company can move forward through the pandemic. Employees' responses can help you create an action plan to address employee concerns and improve your response to COVID-19, including a communication strategy and plan, of course. To show your commitment to their well-being, it's critical that the company share survey results, share what you learned from the survey, and then tell employees how you're going to take action on what you heard. Each time you measure the reach or impact of your communications, evaluate your plan to determine what is working and what is not. Then, use what you learned to further improve your communication strategy and plans. Okay, I've talked about some ways we have helped clients engage their employees, strengthen their company culture, and create a unified and informed employee community. We've covered the how-tos of creating an employee communication strategy and plan. Now, I've got some suggestions on how to make all of this work for you. Let's start with how communications can support the work-life balance of employees. Right now, it seems like most employees are struggling with work-life boundaries. Most likely, you are too. I attended an excellent MadPow webinar last month called Creating Personal Resilience While Working Remotely, and it was such an eye-opener for me personally. During the webinar, Nadret Sahin and Liz Posey-Cortel led attendees through an exercise where we drew a blueprint of our homes, highlighting all the areas where we engaged in work activities. My drawing quickly filled as I marked my home office where I take my video calls, the kitchen table where I find myself reading emails on my phone more often than not, the living room couch where I occasionally bring my laptop in the evenings, etc. Then, Nadrette and Liz instructed us to pick another color to highlight where in our homes we recharged and relaxed. As you might imagine, my overlap between work and relaxing spaces was significant. After working from home for 20 years with few issues with work life balance, I was shocked to see how much I was blurring the lines. So, how can we as communicators help employees, those who work from home and those who work on site, navigate this aspect of a chronic crisis? Consider how we can help employees set boundaries to alleviate stress. For those working remotely, this can be literal boundaries. Like the exercise with Nadrette and Liz, employees need guidance on the importance of keeping workspaces separate from the areas where we relax and recharge if possible. For on site employees, we can share how strategies like taking a walk or an online workout class at the end of a shift can bookend their workday and help them transition into home mode. Work with leadership teams to establish balance. For example, when employees receive emails and texts after hours and on the weekend, they feel pressured to respond immediately. Establishing guidelines that encourage communications during business hours only, except for actual emergencies, will help everyone keep their work time separate from their recharge time. Help employees understand what's expected of them. Work with leaders to share the company's vision for the future, one that incorporates the realities of the present. And then use virtual town halls to communicate your expectations clearly. Make sure you leave time for open questions and feedback from employees. Sure, this might get uncomfortable. These are uncomfortable times. Lucky for us, we're all adults and we can take criticism and address difficult questions. Giving employees the opportunity to openly express themselves goes a long way toward making them feel valued and that their opinions matter. For those employees that need extra flexibility, record your town halls and post them on your intranet for on-demand viewing. Take advantage of your leaders' insights. Provide a regular forum for open dialogue between people leaders and the executive team. Then share those insights with your cross-functional team as you continuously improve your communication strategy and plans. Do more than just say the company supports mental health. That Harvard Business Review article I referenced earlier suggests that leaders should model it so that their employees feel they can prioritize self-care and set boundaries. Often, managers focus on their team's well-being and how to get work done, forgetting to take care of themselves. The article says that we should communicate with leaders that when they share that they're taking a walk in the middle of the day, having a therapy appointment, or prioritizing a staycation and actually turning off their email, they serve as role models for their teams, and at the same time, they prevent their own burnout. Remember that proactive communication helps people find the resources they need, as well as create and maintain their own critical boundaries. If you've implemented new HR policies that provide more schedule flexibility or mental health support resources, communicate those frequently using all available channels. Employees who are struggling may not be reading every newsletter and email. And one more plug for vulnerability here. Shame and stigma prevent many employees from using their mental health benefits to seek treatment. So normalize the use of those services by enlisting leaders who are willing to share their experiences with those resources via blogs and video testimonials. Create a resource hub for your employees. Individuals will need different things at different times. Communicating often about where they can find information and support allows them to access what they need when they need it. Encourage your leaders to communicate more than they think they need to. A Harvard Business Review study with Qualtrics and SAP showed that employees who felt their managers were not good at communicating have been 23% more likely than others to experience mental health declines during the pandemic. Use your channels effectively. The other side of the coin of communicating often is making sure to meet employees where they are. It's 2020. We all want to be communicated to in the ways we prefer about the topics that interest us. Invest in tools that allow your employees to customize the communications they receive to reduce communications that don't apply to them or not of interest. I like what I've seen with tools like Populo and Happio, which let organizations get really granular when deciding how to target their communications, as well as provide robust measurement tools that help track the reach of your communications. Create a feedback loop for your organization. Encourage employees to share their struggles, their suggestions for improvements, and their victories via an email box, a web form, or even a good old-fashioned suggestion box. Then let employees know you're listening by carefully considering all input and responding personally, thanking them for their contribution and sharing any changes being made as a result. One last thought here. That Harvard Business Review survey found that the most commonly desired workplace mental health resources were a more open and accepting culture, clearer information about where to go or whom to ask for support, and training. The COVID-19 crisis has taught us that we must be flexible because plans sometimes have to change. Someday, when things are fine, they will still be different. There's no going back, no time for complacency or nostalgia. It's our job to prepare for ongoing uncertainty, disruption, and change. And though our companies can handle these circumstances in a transformational way, this is an opportunity to empower employees, to be transparent in a way that inspires and builds trust. How employees perceive their employers right now will absolutely impact how they perform in the future. If we get this right, employees will continue to show up now and long term. As organizations work to manage their new normal, preparedness is key to ensuring employees are safe, connected, and engaged. If your organization needs help, we are here for you. Feel free to use the contact information on this slide to connect.